Hello, 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 everyone. If I could have your attention, I hope everyone is enjoying lunch and has enjoyed our panel so far today. Let's give Dr. Carol Swain a wonderful round of applause for everything she's doing to help us. My name is Tiffany Justice. This is Tina Deskovich. We are the co-founders of Moms for Liberty, a national, thank you. Thank you very much. A national organization. We are a grassroots nonprofit helping parents to learn how to effectively advocate for their parental rights at all levels of government. I wanted Tina to come up a little bit today to talk a little bit with you today about how to get involved with Moms for Liberty, and then we'll move on to our keynote. Tina?
As Tiffany said, we're a national nonprofit grassroots organization. We've launched 1 year ago, and in 1 year, we've grown to 167 chapters in 33 states with over 70,000 members. We've heard a lot between last night and today about education, the problems in education, the solutions in education, and several of our speakers have touched very specifically on the role of parents and the role of communities getting involved in public schools. That is what Moms for Liberty is here to do. It's to get us re-engaged. It's to get our eyes on the curriculum, to get our eyes on the policies, and be active participants into the solutions that we need in public education. So we're asking for your help today. A simple way to help is to visit our table back there, up there on the stage. There's a lot of information about the local chapter and some information about the national organization. You can purchase swag if you look around. We have a lot of our moms here in shirts and hats. We have beanies. We have all kinds of things up there. We always accept donations on our website. We are a 501c4. We appreciate your support. I want to take 1 minute here to thank Robin Steenman, our chapter chair in here in Williamson County, for all that she does. Robin, are you out there? She is an amazing chapter leader. And remarkably enough, and we didn't even know till last night when we arrived, we have several chapter chairs here from around the country. If you guys could stand and be recognized, we'd appreciate it. These ladies have really answered the call to save America. So if you see them as you're moving around, please tell them thank you for all the work they're doing. I'm going to turn it back over to Tiffany, and thank you so much.
I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for the day. I'm going to read his bio, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how we all have kind of come together in this fight in America. So Dr. James Lindsay is an American-born author, mathematician, and professional troublemaker. Dr. James Lindsay has written 6 books spanning a range of subjects, including religion, the philosophy of science, and postmodern theory. He is a leading expert on critical race theory, which leads him to reject it completely. He is the founder of New Discourses and currently promoting his new book, Cynical Theories: How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, which is currently being translated into more than 15 languages. I invited James to come and speak today because one of the things that I think has been very interesting over the course of the last few years is that we have seen an expert class in America that we can no longer put our faith in. And that means that Americans really need to dig down deep in ourselves and use every tool in our toolbox to make the change that we want to see in our communities. Robin Steenman, the chapter chair here in Williamson County, exemplifies that. Robin was in the Air Force. She was a bomber pilot in the Air Force. And when I think about the work that Robin, yes, let's give Robin a round of applause for her service. And I was telling someone about Robin the other day and her experience, and they said, well, of course she has that background, because look what she's been able to do in her community. She has been bold, and she has been brave, and she has been willing to do something that many others were not sure how to do. She's willing to lead. Everyone has a role to play. If you're sitting here today and you're wondering what your role is, I want you to take a look inside yourselves and think about what makes you special and how you've been able to lead in your own lives and find a way to help America using those skills. Dr. Lindsay is an interesting man. He is rallying moms across America, teaching them about some of the history of our world that we may not have realized, and helping us to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes. that have been made in the past. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. James Lindsay to the stage. You are in for a fascinating treat and a deep dive into what critical race theory looks like in the classroom and how we can work together to make sure that it doesn't define American education going forward. Thank you.
Hey, y'all. I'm home, kinda, so I can say I'm from Knoxville. I have the distinct privilege not just of getting to speak here with you, and thank you to Moms for Liberty, and thanks to Carol for inviting me, but I also have the distinct privilege of getting to speak all over the country, and this is the third time I've had the opportunity to speak in Tennessee, and it's the best. It's simply the best, not to do that song. There's an energy here, and so what Tiffany just said, I wasn't planning on a speech that starts with what Tiffany just said, but what Tiffany just said is absolutely key. You all are here. You all are moms, teachers, parents, grandparents. You all are the key to sorting out this problem. And the energy in Tennessee, everywhere I've been across the country, in the 3 places I've now spoken in Tennessee, the energy in Tennessee means that Tennessee is going to be a leader. I would like to remind you, if you haven't heard it, since I didn't plan to do this, I'd like to remind you of the Tennessee State Constitution. We've talked a lot about the federal Constitution, but if you don't know, the Tennessee State Constitution is one of the most based constitutions in the United States of America. And Article 1 is our Bill of Rights. It has something like 36 of them. And Section 2 is the one I want to remind you of, given the context that we live in right now. And if I can do it from memory, we'll see how it goes. But as the government is instituted for the common benefit, the doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power shall be considered slavish, absurd, and to the destruction of the happiness and good of mankind. You must resist arbitrary power. Whatever that looks like, that's your charge as a Tennessean. You must resist arbitrary power on your children. I'm going to focus primarily on talking about education since Moms for Liberty invited me. But we're going to talk about critical race theory as well. The title of my talk, I messed up. It's titled Critical Race Theory and the Future of America. It should be titled Critical Race Theory or the Future of America. Because it's actually that simple. I'll give you the simplest definition. It's getting a little trite to say this, that apparently nobody can define critical race theory. I'll give you the simplest definition of critical race theory that you can possibly hold. You think I'm going to say, oh, it's race Marxism, which is pretty simple. It's 2 words, and it's correct. But no, it is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. That's what critical race theory is. It is calling whatever you want to control racist until you control it. That's not American. That's arbitrary power. You must resist arbitrary power. Calling something racist is not a basis for getting to control it. And that's what the entire game is. Why? Because it is race Marxism. It is Marxism using race. But why is it so critical to understand that critical race theory, there's no such thing as critical race theory and the future of America. It is or the future of America. Why is it that existential? Well, I like to do this. I've read this a few times to audiences. I like to read directly from the people I'm criticizing so you know what they actually say. That way I don't have to paraphrase or pretend to memorize part of the Constitution. So a couple of years ago, in 2019, a very famous critical race theorist by the name of Ibram Kendi was asked by Politico magazine to answer a simple question: how do you fix inequality? Of course, Dr. Kendi, just be plain, is not the sharpest tool in the shed. But his answer is very telling, and you're going to see immediately that it's an example of exactly what I was just saying. He says, to fix inequality, we must pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. Pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. The Constitution is the first and the last law of this country. fully amended, I should say. So if we add an anti-racist constitutional amendment, all other law is subject to what that amendment contains. And so we'll read Dr. Kendi's brilliant words. To fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the U.S. Constitution that enshrines two guiding anti-racist principles. Just for posterity, he misspelled principles. And Politico didn't catch it. They got great fact checkers in the media. What are these two principles? One, racial inequity is evidence of racist policy. And two, the different racial groups are equals. Now let me linger on that first one. I said that critical race theory is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. Racial inequity is evidence of racist policy, is Dr. Kendi's core principle for this constitutional amendment. What does that mean? Inequity means that there are differences in outcomes on average by group. That's inequity. So if you see unequal outcomes on average by group, according to the Constitution, should he get his way, that will be called racist. And unless you think I'm making it up, his goal is to control everything that can be called racist by this definition. He goes on. I promise this is only one paragraph. The amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials. Racist ideas would become unconstitutional. A little bit of a contradiction to that First Amendment. It would establish and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism. I, again, kid you not, DOA. The DOA, I mean, come on. And what would this Department of Anti-Racism do? It is going to be comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees, he tells us. What is a formally trained expert on racism? A critical race theorist. That's what it is. The DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity, monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. That's a dictatorship. Absolute authority over the contents of your head, absolute authority over federal law, state law, local law, and private industry policy. That is a totalitarian dictatorship to be run by critical race theorists. It's critical race theory or the future of America. He closes by saying the DOA would be empowered with the disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policies and ideas. This is a dictatorship of the anti-racists. The parallel, since we all know that this is Marxist, is the dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx wanted to see come in to seize the means of production. The idea was going to be that you're going to awaken a class consciousness in the working class. You're going to make them resent the property holders. You're going to awaken that resentment. You're going to awaken a kind of solidarity across all working class workers. Workers of the world unite. And they are going to rise up and seize the means of production and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat that will enforce equity in the name of socialism upon the populace. Until when? Until the populace breaks and it becomes spontaneous. I say the populace breaks, but the truth is that their claim is, the truth is that the population breaks. What they say is that the population would become socialized, as we heard earlier, to see that this is the better way, that this is the way forward. When this becomes spontaneous, you have, finally, the utopia called communism. In critical race theory, it is that you're going to have a Department of Anti-Racism that's going to be a dictatorship of the anti-racists that does not enforce socialism, it enforces equity, which means socialism. but with cultural products, not just material products. And in the end, if you do this long enough and you break the population and it becomes spontaneous, you get what? That thing that has never happened before, that we heard, say, after St. Floyd died. Justice. You get racial justice. The communists have repurposed the word justice to mean communism. It's a bit of a problem. So this is why I keep saying that I mistitled this talk. It is Critical Race Theory or the Future of America. Now, I've described to you already that we are dealing with race Marxism. I've said enough to convince you, I think. I could go through Marx's historicism and compare it to what critical race theory sees as the trajectory of history. You'd see it's the same. I could talk about the way that Marx viewed the ideologists, who are the people who get to work within what he called the superstructure of society that shapes society for the bourgeoisie and its own benefit. They create these justifications called ideology for why they get to have a job and why they're not workers with a hammer and a sickle. And I could tell you that the ideology that they have said within the superstructure of whiteness and critical race theory is white supremacy, and that it creates a structural racism throughout our society. And you would say, wow, that is just Marxism. It's really simple. It is Marxism using race instead of class, or in the words of Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is an education critical race theorist, who wrote a paper in 1995 called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education, because it's not in our schools. She said the point of critical race theory is to make race the central construct for understanding inequality instead of class. It's Marxism repurposed using race instead of class. So what you need to understand, though, because Marxism's not popular. Marxism, especially in the United States, has a long history of failure, a long history of murder, a long history of genocide, catastrophe, and death, a long history of destroying nations. Marxism's not popular. So the question isn't, are they trying to install Marxism? That's obvious. Yes, they are. The question is, how are they trying to install Marxism? And I don't mean, by using race instead of class. It's too abstract. How are they managing it? And one thing you've already heard, they just changed the words. We won't call it communism, we'll call it justice. So St. Floyd dies. We have the guy eventually, Derek Chauvin, gets convicted on 3 counts by the justice system, and we have major Democratic politicians taking to the airwaves within 10 minutes saying this is not justice, it's merely accountability. Justice is a lot more work down the road. And then we have the vice president telling us that the work is every day. Just the other day. The work is communism. The work is communism. So the question is, how on earth, besides tricky language, which we're all starting to see through now, besides tricky language, how on earth are they doing this? And the answer, we've already heard here today as well, has a lot to do with the schools. You've probably heard of the Long March Through the Institutions. This is a Marxist plan that was hatched in the 60s, where a German Marxist by the name of Rudi Dutschke looked at what Mao Zedong had achieved in China, and he also read what the cultural Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci had written, and he said, this is how you infiltrate the institutions, and the most important institution to infiltrate is education. Mao knew this. Gramsci knew it too. Gramsci said there are 5 cultural pillars you have to infiltrate and culturally change from within to Marxism if you want to overturn a Western society. Those are religion, it's definitely happening there, family, we all feel it, education, media, and law. We could add healthcare to that now for sure. Education works differently than the others. This isn't like a table with 5 legs. It's one of those tables that has 4 legs that come up in a V off of a single thing. And education's the pillar that holds them all up. Why? Where do you get your pastors? They go to seminary. Where do you get your doctors? They go to medical school. Where do you get your lawyers? They go to law school. Where do you get your teachers? They go to teaching college. Where do you get your media personalities? They study communications. They go to college. Education is the key. You get a couple of generations of students, and they're going to demand that the universities bend to their will while the universities are pumping this stuff into them at the same time. And you have this kind of perfect storm, kind of a revolving circle where you have it being grassroots underneath by the students demanded, top down, pressed down from the administration, applied, and from the faculty applied, and you can change the institutions from within. The neo-Marxists of the 1970s were very unpopular. The New Left, they called them. They were violent. They blew things up. People didn't like them. So what did they do? They gave up their life of crime and went into K through 12 activism, primarily. And they explicitly and intentionally started going into the teaching colleges. They call this the critical turn in education. And they infiltrated our education system with the intent, and this is in their own words, of becoming like viruses that would infect other disciplines. They say that their perfect, ideal metaphor for themselves is a virus. They compare themselves favorably to HIV, Ebola, and AIDS. Especially AIDS because it suppresses the immune system, which they identify with conservatives. Needs to be suppressed. They say that the virus is the perfect metaphor. You train these kids in college, maybe they study journalism, maybe they study media, and then you send them out into the world to infect the institution in the real world. So you can take over a society by changing its institutions, and you can take over its institutions by changing education, while dismantling the family, while dismantling faith, which are huge, huge cultural bulwarks that stop this kind of thing from taking over. So how are you going to do that? Well, you use the schools, and this is what I really want to communicate to you. We're going to use a metaphor that's maybe a little uncomfortable given the pandemic, past tense pandemic. It lasted for 15 days. They told us that from the beginning. We're on day like 666 of that or something. That was a couple weeks ago, to be honest, but the metaphor I want to use is of an injection. And this is where we're going to turn our attention to the schools, although there are other things. This is all happening in healthcare as well. Racism, the T.H. Chan School of Public Health, which was paid for by CCP money through an individual named Ronnie Chan, if we're going to name names. The T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard, by the way, was bought by a Chinese national at the tune of $500 million a few years ago. Harvard Crimson reported on it. Freshmen at Harvard wrote this story. Nobody paid attention. T.H. Chan School said that racism is a public health threat. It is the key public health threat. We have states that are determining who can have monoclonal antibodies and not based on their race. It's one of many factors. That's how they get around it. They put in many factors. They give you an overall composite score. But they're just denying people based on race certain treatments. They wanted to prioritize the vaccine, which is a little bit funny given all the other things they yell about. Make black and brown people take the experimental vaccine first. I mean, seriously. These people are stupid. But what I want to say is that you have a syringe with a poison in it. In critical race theory, you think I'm going to say is the poison. It's not. It wouldn't work. It's not. America's too strong for that. As weak as we can be to racism, as inflamed as we can get around race, we're too strong for that. It doesn't work. We're looking at not just Marxism, but Maoism. Mao Zedong is the model. And it worked in China. And here's how it works. There are two poisons, or two injections if you want. There are two poisons in that syringe. They are critical race theory and queer theory. And they work in tandem. The name of the syringe in your school is social emotional learning. Social emotional learning works like this. We'll come back to queer theory in a minute, I promise. Everybody's on tenterhooks about that. Social emotional learning works like this. We're going to pretend that school teachers are psychologists. We're now going to let them practice unlicensed psychiatry in classrooms, which are unregulated settings, on children in a group, often by doing things that make them vulnerable, that make them uncomfortable, and then that will give them a way out of that vulnerability and discomfort by telling them the right answers to how they're supposed to feel about things. There's your emotional learning. How they're supposed to interact with one another. There's your social learning, which has another name, which is socialization. And socialization is the project that Marx said makes man turn to social man, which is short for socialist man, who is a man who cannot live outside of a socialist system. That's what you do. That's the social part of social emotional learning. Now, I don't want to crap on the whole of social emotional learning. We have to be very careful because we'll have something thrown back in our faces. Social emotional learning started out to help troubled children who really were troubled children, and it had resounding success when it was applied by psychologists in one-on-one settings with troubled children who had learning issues, problems at home, etc. So they have also, unfortunately for us, a mountain of data saying, wow, it works. They have no data saying that it works when you start applying it broad brush to everybody by unqualified teachers. 6 weeks course or whatever on a Zoom doesn't make you a psychologist. In a unregulated, non-therapeutic space, in a group setting that works out to doing an awful lot of shaming. You get people to talk about their bodies and what they're uncomfortable with. This is where the queer theory. You start telling them about, maybe you're not sure about if you're a boy or a girl. Here's the queer theory again. You get them uncomfortable. This is blatant cult indoctrination 101. If you don't know how to indoctrinate somebody into a cult, let me tell you. Listen to me. No, I'm kidding. Everybody, when I snap, no, I'm kidding. The way you indoctrinate somebody into a cult is you induce or inflame a sense of fear or vulnerability, emotional vulnerability, and then you give them a pathway out of that fear or vulnerability through the accepted doctrine of the cult. Does it sound like what you listen to on CNN with all these variants? It's called fear cycling. It's a psyops. It works there too. But what they do in the school is they get these kids vulnerable. And here's what Mao Zedong did, so I can compare it back to Mao. Because Maoism is the tool that makes a cultural revolution work. And a cultural revolution is what opens the door to Marxism in a Western country. And here's what you do. Mao Zedong separated. He created 10 identities for Chinese kids. 5 of them were black identities. Those were bad. 5 of them were red for communism. Those were good. The black identities were things like landlord, rich farmer, counter-revolutionary, bad influence, things like that. The red identities were Marxists, revolutionaries, people from the Red Guard, etc. Peasants, day laborers, because it was the working class. Now imagine this. Now imagine you take something like critical race theory. You've got the syringe of social emotional learning. So you break kids down, cult indoctrination style, psychologically open them up, vulnerability, and then you tell them the way that you actually make them vulnerable is you start talking about their most personal stuff, their identity. And you tell them, maybe you don't feel like wearing a suit and jacket. Maybe you want to wear a dress. Are you a boy or a girl? That's the queer theory side. Or you tell them, this country was founded on white racism, and it's never really gone away. Did you know, by the way, that critical race theorists don't think we've had any racial progress? And as a matter of fact, they think it's gone backwards. They actually believe that racism has got worse, not better, because it's less visible. It used to be really easy to see. Now it's just the same as during slavery. But nobody can see it because everybody hides it so well behind what they call a racial contract that nobody ever talks about, nobody ever mentions, but we all sign up to. It sounds like a conspiracy theory. So there's these races like white people who have all this racial generational guilt. So you white kids start feeling real vulnerable. I'm the worst kind of person. I remember reading that from a 7-year-old. The story was he got in his mom's car after school, picked up, he's all bummed out. What's wrong, buddy? I'm the worst kind of person. Well, what do you mean? I'm white. You make them vulnerable. You create a black identity in Maoist terms. White, straight, male, cisgender, etc. There's like 50 of them. Mentally well, as opposed to mentally ill. Black identity. And then you say, well, you know what? You can become an ally. That's a red identity, racial ally. You could transition. You could be non-binary. You could be bisexual. Those are all protected minority classes. Those are red identities. You could do the work, become a revolutionary. Red identity. You could basically become the critical race and queer theory equivalent of an identity-based activist, an identity Marxist activist. That is a red identity. You could do the right thing and protect your family and get vaccinated. Red identity, instead of the dirty black identity of unvaccinated. Who has to wear a mask? Who has to be doused in hand sanitizer? I actually got an email from a woman this morning and from Vermont who told me that her child, she's seeing what they're doing through the social emotional learning and how they're using these tools to break her child down socially and emotionally and tell them what the right emotional responses are. And she told me, in no uncertain terms, I would rather they hit my child than break him down psychologically. And so what you're doing then is you give especially these young white girls no positive possibility of an identity unless they transition. And we see a massive, massive, massive spike, 4,000+% if I'm not mistaken, in young women, girls transitioning, 13-year-olds trying to sign up for double mastectomies so they can get their red identity. Now, when we get to queer theory, though, I have to elucidate something to you, because now you see, I've got a bunch of mixed metaphors here, but you see how the two poisons work together. Another way you can see it is we got one monster, and it's kind of shadowy. We don't know for sure what we're fighting. We know it's Marxist, and we can see its left hand is queer theory and its right hand is critical race theory. So you deck them with critical race theory, and you make them feel bad about who they happen to be as a person, what their skin color is, who their parents and grandparents were, and what they might or might not even have done. I got a guy I'm friends with, his parents immigrated from France in the 1950s, and he gets called a descendant of slaveholders all the time. It's just made up. So you bludgeon them with the one hand, and then you give them the way out with the other. And you break them down psychologically so that they feel like they have to do it to have any self-worth. That's the Maoist program that's happening in our schools under the brand name of social emotional learning, which used to be great and has been co-opted by the Marxists. I was told I couldn't swear unless I used communist exactly after, by the f***ing communists. I didn't do it. That's how this works. That's how this works. And you do one generation of kids after another generation of kids after another generation of kids, like we heard from the pastor earlier. You do that one after another, and they think that's how it is. And we keep hearing the word indoctrination with this. And what you're going to realize real quick, this is not indoctrination. This is much worse than indoctrination. Because what's a doctrine? This is programming. This is programming. And for you older folks, reprogramming, or as they called it in the old days, re-education. This is Soviet. This is what it is. This is how it works. This is what we're up against in our schools. And so you see, I think is when the paper was published. And it explains that queer theory is not about it says this explicitly, queer theory is not about creating a stable LGBTQ identity. That's antithetical to queer theory. I know many people who from the 80s and 90s even were fighting for gay equality, a real civil rights movement in this society. And you know what they say? If I had to be queer, I never would have come out. That's an exact quote from one. A very famous one, but I won't name him just in case he doesn't want to be named. Queer theory is not about creating a stable LGBT, I won't even say Q, identity. It is about creating an unstable identity. It is, by definition, the definition of queer in queer theory is an identity without an essence. That's what they want your child to have. They want either racial grievance or an identity without an essence, or some combination thereof. This is a mentally disordered child that they are producing. And why? Because they're manipulable. Same reason that they can't read or write for themselves, because then they have to be told what the right answers are. They have to be told how you're supposed to act. They have to be told what their emotional response is supposed to be. They have to be told what being a good social man looks like. And who's going to put themselves in the position of telling? Formally trained experts in racism is the term of the realm. Critical race theorists, queer theorists, identity communists. And they're doing it to manipulate your children. The goal is not to create stable identities, it's to create the inability to know who you are. Queer theory more than any of the others, but all of these critical theories of identity are an acid meant to dissolve you and your society. Why? Let's circle back to Mr. Gramsci. Why would you do this, Mao Zedong? Why would you use social emotional learning, Chairman? Well, because those two last pillars. It's easy to infiltrate media. Look at that. Turns out to be a little harder to infiltrate law, but not impossible. Justice Sotomayor. Turns out not to be terribly hard even to infiltrate education, at least when conservatives decide to cede education for 50 years to leftists. Just give up on that project, let them have it. Turns out not to be that hard to infiltrate those. Harder to infiltrate faith. Harder to infiltrate the family. Now here's a couple of points. Imagine that you've got a child filled with racial resentment and confusion, with an identity without an essence, not real positive about the country that he's been raised in, thinks he's any number of different sexual, gender, and romantic identities. If you didn't know, by the way, not just are there sexual identities, there are romantic identities. They have to make it more complicated. You can be demisexual and lithromantic at the same time, while having a xenogender. A xenogender, by the way, is a gender that is alien to the concept of gender, like tree or dragon, or nebula, or sun, or solar system, or universe, as your gender. Demisexual means being a healthy woman. It means that you're only sexually attracted to people that you're in love with. I forgot what lith means. It's on my website. You can look up. I forgot. So they come home. You're, what do we say? Lithromantic, demisexual, xenogender tree kid with pronouns tree self. Comes home and is trying to relate. It says some of this. Like, what did you learn at school today, Johnny? I learned that I'm a demisexual, lithromantic, tree gender with pronouns tree self. Mom, grandma, and dad sitting there for a minute like, what? What's Johnny say? Just kidding, he goes by Lavender now. It's like a tree, but not really, and they get things wrong. It's a plant, it's a joke. So what he says is, you don't understand. You come from a different generation, a different time. You don't know what it's like to be me now. You don't even know what these words mean. You don't know who I am. And the institution of the family gets hit with lightning. And then you say, no. God created man and woman, made them companions. And they say, that's old stuff. The Bible doesn't apply to us anymore. And then you've infiltrated the institution of faith. You get the children to reject both family and faith by giving them identities that both family and faith don't know what to do with. They don't know. There are a lot of things in the Bible. It's supposed to cover all things. Lithsexual ain't in there. It ain't in there because it's made up. It's a Marxist indoctrination tool following through the sexual revolution crap that started with George Lukács, who's a Hungarian sadist who was huge in the Bela Kun regime that didn't last very long in Hungary when it went communist in 1919. That's where that all started. It's a communist plot. Why? Why did George Lukács do that? Because he knew it would destroy the family, and faith. That's what it's about. Mao called it destroying the four olds, Sujiu in Mandarin. The four olds were old customs, old habits, old culture, old ways of thinking. They had to be destroyed. I've had the privilege of going to Beijing a number of times, and I've visited the Lama Temple, which is one of the few places left in Beijing that has artifacts older than 1950. Has 900,000-year-old, 1,100-year-old artifacts still. Because these students hopped up on their red and black identities, went and started tearing down statues, raiding temples and destroying everything in them, tearing down all of the old culture, old customs, old habits, and old ways of thinking. This also involved beating up their parents and grandparents, sometimes to death, and their teachers, who had black identities given to them by some government official who wanted them beat to death. This is the road that we are on. Social emotional learning is the name of the syringe. Our red and black identities are defined in terms of things like critical race theory and queer theory. And that's how they are programming our children to understand the world, our country, and themselves, and you. On faith, by the way, there's also, if you don't know this, there's also direct infiltration. A lot of people will have heard, I don't know how many Southern Baptists we got up in here, but in 2019 in April at the Southern Baptist National Convention, they passed what was called Resolution 9 under very shady circumstances. Resolution 9 said they were going to bring critical race theory and intersectionality as an analytical tool subordinate to Scripture. How many of y'all think that critical race theory is designed to stay subordinate to anything? It is literally an ideology predicated on the idea that anything that subordinates is evil and must be overthrown and replaced with itself. That's its whole idea as an analytical tool. So it's going to be subordinate to Scripture, not for long. And the fearless leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention, under very shady circumstances, namely there were 13 resolutions on the table that year. They had lots of time to discuss resolutions 1 through 8. Whoops, we ran out of time. Oh no. Resolutions 9 through 13 voted on in a single block, no discussion. I know, I saw the video. I'm actually in a documentary about it. Very, very shady circumstances. So they bring this in, subordinate to Scripture. No, to subordinate Scripture. In the Southern Baptist Convention, which has some umpteen million people involved in it and $80 billion. It's actually if it were a country, the Southern Baptist Convention is a larger country, both in economics and population, than Australia, which is also communist now. So now you get a real picture of what's going on here. The goal is to subvert the key institutions that keep America going, that keep the American dream alive. The tool primarily is in education through social emotional learning, injecting critical race theory and queer theory poison into kids so that they interact in a way that replicates, literally, Mao Zedong's injection of Leninist Marxism or Bolshevism into China, which worked. Might have killed 100 million people between 1966 and 1976 in the process, or thereabouts. Nobody knows how many. China's not in great shape these days. We see it as this big giant world power, but that's because it opened its markets and stopped being communist, in full tilt anyway. It's in bad shape as it is anyway, because when you're communist, even when you have open markets, you lie about everything, and now their housing market bubble is exploding. I've been told that they're likely to lose over $7 trillion in asset value in the next 12 months, possibly. I don't know if that will actually occur, but that's the scale of the depression that they're headed for all their lies. And we're doing this to ourselves now here. And so what are we going to do? What can we do? And the answer is to look at what they said the plan is and do it backwards. They said we're going to dismantle faith. We're going to separate one generation from the next, both in terms of family and faith. So you're like, no, we're going to start mentoring children. I keep hearing the word disciple. Now, I mean, personally, I don't even believe in God, but I think you should disciple your children. I think that we should have robust faith. I think that everybody has the private conscience that they have, and they have an inalienable right to the contents of that conscience, and the government doesn't get to impose a state woke religion into it. I think that the Southern Baptist Convention has no business, or the Marxist Pope has no business, or the PCA has no business coming in and changing one faith after another, after another, after another, so that it sounds like Catholicism, or it sounds like Southern Baptist, or it sounds like Presbyterianism, or it sounds like Islam, or it sounds like Buddhism, or it sounds like Judaism, but it professes social justice, which, remember, socialist justice means communism. A bunch of fake faiths preaching some other one, now with the United States of America's federal government's backing, against the key provision of the First Amendment, which all of these other life, liberty, pursuit of happiness things we want to talk about. Religious liberty was the reason this country was founded. There is a reason 1620 was the year of the Pilgrims' Pride. They were pilgrims because they were Calvinists, and Europe had had enough of them. We're like, get out. You have no quarter here. And they said, let's go found a country where we're not going to do that to people. So even if you want to be a communist, you have the right to your religion in this country. But that doesn't mean it has to be given access to power. So you have to remove these people from the levers of power. You have to take their school board seats. You have to take their county commission seats. You have to take their state house seats. You have to primary every person, not just who espouses these ideas, Democrat or Republican, but who isn't willing to stand up to them. That's something. You have to, again, like I said, we have to reinstall those social institutions. You need to connect across generations. We need healthy schools that do that. We need healthy churches that do that. We need healthy families that do that. We need to gear policy where public policy matters to making sure that it doesn't get in the way of having healthy families and healthy schools and robust churches that can raise up a new generation one after another. We have to protect these institutions. We have to continue to let alternative medias flourish, because the flame of truth will burn down any box it's put in. CNN can't hold back the truth forever. We see it happening around us. We have a second enlightenment coming. We're well into it, and we're now seeing the last grasp of the old power structure turning to Marxism as its desperate attempt, teaming up with Marxism, I should say. The Marxists always wanted it. Now you have the companies, the corporations wanting it. Why? What happened to the capitalists? They know they're about to be deposed, and they want to shut you up and stop you from being able to speak and stop you from being able to meet through a social credit system and a broad social media censorship campaign so that they can't be exposed as frauds, liars, and criminals and removed from power. That's what it all boils down to. So you have to resist that by doing exactly what they don't want you to do. That's all it takes. But we heard last night from Dr. Carson, and he said that we already have this he said the diversity is our strength in this country. I want to tell you, we hear about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, we already know that equity means socialism, but I'm going to give it a handful of credit for a second, and I'm going to use the lie that they use in truth. They say that equity is not about equal outcomes, it's about equal access. So we'll take them at their lie. It's not for them. They measure whether access was equal by if the outcomes were equal, so they lie. But if it really is about equal access, let's grant the word. We, in the United States of America, already have the best diversity, equity, and inclusion program this world has ever come up with. In Latin, it's e pluribus unum. From many, one. In the Declaration of Independence, it's that we are all created equal and granted certain inalienable rights, among them the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Our Constitution and Bill of Rights were written to preserve that in the people, not in the government. The government, by the way, doesn't have free speech to use critical race theory on your kids. That's another lie. We have more diversity in this country because this country has always welcomed it. And because you come here, you become a citizen, and you are as American as every other American. My experience, a lot of fully legal immigrants in this country are more American than almost anybody. They're wearing like America suits, flying America flags, like shooting off fireworks on any given Tuesday. Because they love this country and they know what it represents. They know what they can build here. We heard that from Dr. Carson. I don't have to go over it again. We already have diversity, and our diversity is our strength, and our unity comes in the fact that we recognize that we are many different people who have come together as one. So we remember that founding principle, e pluribus unum. We have equality of access. That's the American dream that we are keeping alive. We didn't always, and that promissory note that Dr. King spoke about was meant to be fulfilled, and we had a civil rights movement, and we threw off those specters of the past to the best of our ability, and we have been moving forward rapidly ever since. Not to say everything's perfect, but it doesn't need to be. It's a project, and we're in it together. We already have the best diversity and equity. And inclusion, same thing. We're just getting redundant at this point. You want to be an American? Become a citizen. Welcome. You're included. Get a job. The American dream is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the thing they're selling us as diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether it's in schools, whether it's in corporations, or whether it's in faith, is a fraud. It is a simulacrum of the real thing. It is a fake, a phony, and it should actually be prosecuted under consumer protection laws as such. It does not even deliver the goods. You could say we did the experiment, and does it make things better? No, it makes things worse. Everywhere it's installed, the data aren't equivocal. Companies are falling apart. Internal corporate culture is a catastrophe. I just read this horrendous thread about what it's like to work in a tech company now. And it's all just feelings, 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 and nobody doing their job. It's constant identity this, identity that, people getting told about their identity, and then all of a sudden somebody comes out as gay. We have to have a gay sensitivity meeting. Now everybody in the office for 3 months comes and says, what's your sex life like? Great hostile working environment it creates. It's a catastrophe. So we even did the experiment. We gave them the benefit of the doubt, and they failed the test. It's a fraud. So it should be prosecuted as such, attorneys general. As for you, if you're not an attorney general, what can you do? Proclaim these values of the United States. Bring them to the next generation. Connect with that generation and show them, like we heard from CJ this morning. Remind them and yourself, how much is at stake? CJ told us at 19 years old, he said, how much stake he has in this country succeeding. And he's right. And he's 19, which means there's 18 years younger than him. And they are at stake too. So you've got to stand up. You've got to fight. You've got to find your role in this fight, and you need to take it up. And keep principle at the center of that. E pluribus unum. All men are created equal. And if you are of faith, your faith. That's what I've got to say to you. Thank you.
Well, that was really awesome. So we have one more panel for you today. I'm going to do 5 minutes for a bathroom break. Get up, get some water, maybe throw your garbage away if you'd like, and then we're going to start with our afternoon panel, and we'll make sure we get you out of here before the snow starts. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Is the mic on? Hello. Hope everyone had a lovely lunch. Thank you again. Let's give James Lindsay a big round of applause again for that wonderful keynote today. Thank you. So again, my name is Tiffany Justice. I'm the co-founder of Moms for Liberty. Tina Deskovich is here with me. We are united parents across the country fighting to reclaim public education, fighting to reclaim our parental rights and to defend them at all levels of government. And so James gave us an inside look into some of the things that are happening in this country and maybe some of the roots of where it started. And today we are joined by some amazing fighters, people that have worked within the public education system in many different ways and private education system, and teachers and school board members and advocates. So I'd like to introduce our panel today. And if you look at your program, we've had a kind of a change in who's on our schedule. So I'm going to introduce everyone. We'll start at the end with Erica Donalds. Erica is the founder of Optima Foundation, which is helping to provide high-quality educational choices for children in this country. But before that, Erica's first a mom of 3 boys, and she also served as a school board member in Florida. Much like Tina and I, Erica saw behind the education curtain, and what she saw wasn't pretty. And so she decided, rather than kind of walking away and deciding, as most people could, to not do anything else, she decided that she was going to create better options for children in this country, and that's really what the American dream is about. So thank you, Erica, for joining us today. Next is Mr. Paul Rossi. Paul is a teacher at the Grace School in New York City. Oftentimes we're told, find another option for your children if you don't like public school. Send them to private school. Paul's going to tell us a little bit about what's happening in independent schools across this country, what you need to know about that, and perhaps as a parent, some of the steps that you can help to take to support teachers in private schools. Mr. Tony Kennett is from Indiana. He worked in Indianapolis schools as a science administrator. He is now the founder and editor of the Chalkboard Review, or
just the co-founder and owner. I hire out the EIC position. I don't edit. No thanks.
Okay. And so Tony is helping to give a voice to teachers around this country so that they can feel supported in coming out and speaking about what's happening in the schools and helping to give them other options about how to make the change happen that they want to see. And Mr. Terrace Todd, who has a very impressive title that I'm going to have to look at my paper to read. Mr. Terrace Todd is with the Heritage Foundation. He is the program manager of the Civil Society of American Dialogue. Before that, he was the executive director of the White House Initiative on Education Excellence for African American Students. So welcome to our panel today. This isn't about me, this is about all of you. So I'm gonna kind of open up the discussion right away to talk about, what are some of the things that you've heard today so far that you might wanna jump and start talking about? We've had a question that's been posed today. Do we reform public education? Is it possible? What does it look like? So anyone who wants to start and jump in and start talking about what's happening in our schools?
Ladies first.
Ladies first, of course. I think that is a big question that across the country, organizations like Moms for Liberty and just in our communities, people are asking themselves, is it reformable? Should we burn the whole thing down and start from scratch, or can there be reforms in what we right now call the public education system, or refer to as a public education system? And most of us, when we say that, we're talking about the government-run schools. And I run right now 3 charter schools, and we're opening more and more of those every year in Florida. And one time I was at a school board meeting, and this union person who's speaking against me, which happens often, said, if you could, you would make all those charter schools private schools. And I was like, yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Because ultimately, having been a school board member myself, as Tiffany mentioned, I have reservations about the monopoly reforming itself. And that doesn't mean I don't very much support all of the people who are running for school board, who are hoping to get that majority to make a huge difference in that arena. But ultimately, I believe in the free market. And I think I trust the free market more than I trust any one of these candidates to get up there and do the bold, huge things that have to be done in order for the system to truly be reformed. And what the free market does in giving people the ability to make decisions that benefit themselves and their children is it puts the pressure on everyone to bring value to the marketplace. And what is value to us as parents? The value is that I can send my child to a school where I don't have to have a law that says that they can't teach CRT. And I don't have to have a camera in the classroom to make sure that the teacher is teaching what I want them to teach and not teaching what I don't want them to teach, because I actually get to select the people that are going to be in that classroom and select the leaders of that school who I'm going to entrust my children with day to day. And when that happens, I can select the people that I do trust. And I really feel like that's the way to make these reforms. That doesn't mean that public education goes away and there's no place for a public education system. But what it means is that that system has to compete, and that marketplace, a healthy education marketplace, is going to provide the best access and the best quality to the most people ultimately. And so I hope that all of us, whether we're on the side of burning it down or on the side of getting in there and making the reforms, that we're all working toward that goal in some way to truly put all of the power back in the hands of the parents. And I hope that makes sense.
I'd like to pick up on that because it's really a good point about private education being a potential solution. Fortunately, coming from that world myself, I can tell you that that's not in itself a solution. Many of the religious schools, particularly the school that I came from, was hijacked, captured by woke ideology. It was a religious school, in quotes. It was an Episcopal school, had a rich history, century old, but it slightly changed to an institution that was grounded in Episcopal values. And going back to what James was saying earlier about the way that wokeness works in a viral mechanism, what I saw was that the attachment proteins are the existing religious missions. And what's happening is that that moral sense of virtue and that long tradition of morality is being hijacked on empathy. Empathy is crowding out all the other moralities which form the basis of these schools that have done wonderful work up to this point. So you have to be, particularly among the 1,600, not all of them had a religious tradition, but the 1,600 quote-unquote elite private schools that are all governed by the same association, the National Association of Independent Schools. If that is an option for you, you have to be very, very careful and ask very, very pointed questions, which they do not want you to ask, about how that mission is being implemented in the curriculum, in the special DEI programs that they are running. And I've just spent the last month and a half watching hundreds of hours of footage from a conference, which is the flagship conference of these top private schools, where I've gained a really interesting understanding of how this manifests in the classroom at the lowest grades. We're talking kindergarten through 8 and beyond. So I would just say that what you're saying I agree with about private schools. It's just that you have to be extra careful.
And I think it's within that I think that really a lot of the legislative action around the country is really boiled down to is that, of course, you can open up the market and you can put pressure on schools to perform, but I'm also paying for the public school. My money is going into those schools. So when it's state-sponsored curriculum, I don't want it to segregate my children. When it's state-sponsored shoving in certain things that have no business being in front of a child at that age, I don't want it in my schools. I'm paying for it. I'm footing the bill. So while I think that opening the market is really important, we also need to keep in mind that it's our tax dollars that are paying for these things, and therefore the state is accountable to me, the buyer, the funder, and the creditor.
And ditto to what everyone else said, for the most part. But again, I think a lot of this has to be re-engineered. Again, as a White House appointee to the Department of Ed in May of 2020, working on behalf of African American students all over the country, the re-engineering must happen. And I agree, we have to open the market up so that way it becomes a little bit more competitive. I think that's why many of the folks that are coming into our country from all over the world, into our colleges and universities, they're competitive markets. They literally compete for those students. I know my daughters in particular were getting mail all the time, trying to send them gifts and say, hey, come here, whatever. How come the local schools, the K-12 schools, doesn't have to compete for our kids, And so I really would love to see the market be open, and that way it becomes a little bit more competitive, and then maybe we'll see the quality of the education get a little bit better, or get a lot more better, for the sake of our kids and the future of this country.
Thank you, and I'll start with you. Yeah, that's an awesome answer. Thank you, Terrace. I will start with you next. I won't make. I'll let you go first, so you don't have to echo everybody else, right? So, Arizona Governor Doug Ducey recently made I think it was his 8th and final State of the State address, and he said something really interesting. Does anyone know what Governor Ducey said? Did you hear what he said? I'm going to read his words here. He said, 50 years ago, politicians stood in the schoolhouse door and wouldn't let minorities in. Today, union-backed politicians stand in the schoolhouse door and won't let minorities out. Many of our poor kids and children of color are trapped in a failing school. It's time to set these families free. So, Terrace, if you could, yeah, I mean, what strong words coming from a governor, right? Terrace, we'll start with you. What work have you seen done in the Department of Education and through your work in the African American Academic Excellence Office? What strides have we taken as a public education system to try to create opportunities for families?
Well, first and foremost, school choice is the greatest thing ever, to give families the choice, because, again, let's be honest, I mean, at some point in time in this country, African-American students didn't have choice, you know what I mean? And so to now lock them down into a system that's failing is totally immoral, and quite frankly, it is racist. Racism is tied to economics, and so, and if education is the great equalizer to a better lifestyle in the future towards a great career, locking them down is absolutely, it's a racist act. And so some of the work that we've seen, though, I think I see homeschooling actually starting to increase all over the country, in particular in the state of Florida. When myself and my colleague, Katie Gorka, had come to Florida to the homeschool convention there, we realized that the numbers of African-American families that are now starting to homeschool is growing, and quite frankly, it should. Because if you are not satisfied with where your children are, then find and pray a way to God that you're able to actually homeschool them, so that way you can control what goes into your child's brain. Again, it was said earlier, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he gets old, he won't depart from it. It didn't say to hand them off to the government to do that. That's right. You get what I'm saying? So I would love to see that a little bit more. I would love to see that more families are starting to really homeschool, to be honest with you. And that's some of the things that I've actually acknowledged during my time at the Department of Ed, that homeschooling was now this trend that's actually growing amongst African-American families. So keep it up the good work on that one.
I'm going to then go to Erica, because Erica, I wanted to ask you, in your role as a school board member, you know, Governor Ducey talks about union-backed politicians. What role is the union playing in keeping students locked in schools?
But I want to shout out to Rebecca Friedrichs, because her book about standing against Goliath, sorry, I don't know the name, but she's amazing. And her book really tells you some great stories about this. But as a school board member, I certainly experienced this. And there's a particular story that I like to tell about why unions are the biggest enemy to quality public education in our country. When I was a school board member, I negotiated as a minority member about $7.5 million, a pot of money, to get the highest quality veteran teachers to go out to an area of our county called Immokalee, Florida, high poverty, very low income, transient community, and almost 80-90% minority in each one of those schools, and many of those schools failing. But the most important metric in those schools was that out of all of the teachers in our county, 20% of the teachers in Immokalee were brand new. 20%. The rest of the county, that figure was only 6%. And so my goal was to even that out. Now, how do we get more veteran teachers out into Immokalee, high-performing teachers? Well, how do you do that? You incentivize them, right? It's far. It's like a 45-minute drive for most of us to get out there. And so what I wanted to do is do a progressive bonus system. So they'd get $1,000 the first year, $3,000 the second year, $5,000 the third year, to get them out there and have them stay for at least 3 years. And it would only be available to veteran, high-performing teachers. And I actually got the rest of the school board to agree on that. But once that proposal went to the bargaining table, what came back was $2,500 for every single teacher that teaches in Immokalee, no matter their performance, no matter how long they'd been teaching, $2,500 for 1 year. So what did that do to the number that we were trying to move? What did that do to the 20% of brand new teachers that were in Immokalee versus 6% for the rest of the county? Absolutely nothing. And we could have done it if not for being blocked by the unions. And so the unions don't have children's interests first, because if they did, they would allow us to incentivize hard to staff positions like math and science to get people from the professions to come in and teach our children those things, in our high schools especially. And they would allow us to incentivize teachers, the best teachers, to go teach in the hardest to teach schools with additional compensation. And they won't allow it, not in my district and not in any district. And that's racist. It truly is.
Tony, what's your experience been like with unions in schools? You've worked as a teacher and as an administrator in the system. What's that been like for you?
So as of last week, I've convinced my 115th teacher to leave the Indiana State Teachers Association. And had the opportunity by accident to stand next to the executive director of the Indiana State Teachers Association at the last time I testified before the Senate, and he was really unhappy I was standing next to him. And I think the reason is because we charge our teachers in Indiana $700 annually. In many other states, it's between $1,200 and $1,500 annually. That amount of money to do absolutely nothing. And Todd Rokita, the Attorney General in Indiana, enjoys rubbing this in because he sends a letter out to every teacher in the state of Indiana at the beginning of the year saying that we will represent you as a state, because you're a state employee, in any lawsuit that you find yourself in. And that's the only thing the union really has going for it, other than collective bargaining, which they do horribly. They injected themselves into my textbook adoption committee for the Indianapolis public school system. They made a separate racial equity group that had to approve all of my decisions for the textbook adoption committee. Notably, no one on that committee, the racial equity committee, could actually speak Spanish. None of them had ever worked in any of the Midwestern Hispanic communities, so like the most critical race theorists, they're completely ignoring the Hispanic population of this country. They have in no way, shape, or form worked on achieving STEM in any way, shape, or form in our school system or in the surrounding Indianapolis systems. But the union says they have to be there. So despite the fact that they're inexperienced, despite the fact that they're incredibly politically biased, and despite the fact that they didn't read any of the material that I sent them while I was at the district, they still had incredible power. And I found that rather disgruntling, to say the least. But that's what's happening all over the state. It's happening all over the country. It's individuals who feel that their cushy time getting to sit in chairs on the backs of teachers' salary and on the backs of school fund mismanagement, they feel threatened that we want to take a second look at what they're teaching, how they're doing it, and how they're being paid for it. And that's unacceptable.
So, Paul, I know that you worked in the private school system, but I know you've written a little bit about a lot of the peer pressure within the school environment amongst teachers and in the curriculum. So if you just want to talk a little bit about, and maybe any advice for teachers in the audience about, you took a real stand in your school, and I know that was very difficult to do.
Yeah, it's different, of course, in private schools. And in my school and many of the schools, in New York City, teachers have a year contract. And unless you run afoul of, if you get too many parent complaints, or you just become unpopular, or someone anathema to the community, however that's defined, you're fine. There's an expectation that, they'll give you another contract, year to year to year. And there are teachers there that have been there a very long time. They're very happy. They're very satisfied. Administration is satisfied with them. But the pressure, because of the lack of collective bargaining arrangements, you are vulnerable, and you are susceptible to a tremendous amount of pressure of trying to dance to the tune of the administration, or else you're deemed not a good fit. And they'll have that conversation with you. They'll say, are you happy here? Perhaps you want to go in a different direction. Perhaps this is not the place for you. Now, in my case, there are no other places for me because it's endemic throughout the system. There's a market, right? But what we have in private education among the 1,600 National Association of Independent Schools is a cartel. They are entirely, they have accreditors in 25 regions across the country, and they're all running from the same playbook. And that playbook is that woke DEI is de rigueur. You cannot take a different path. And there's a whole nexus of consultancies and self-dealing boards in relation to those consultancies where you really are trapped. Now, of course, there is a market. I can go teach at a small school. You know, they're great schools. People have approached me and said, you know, we'd love to have you, and that's great. But you know, it is. I guess I would call it like a half cartel among this group. And the thing that's even stranger about this and more disturbing is that, you know, wokeness is the religion of the elite, okay? And these schools are going to pass people on to the Harvard, Yale, the Ivies, you know, these schools, and they are the ones that are going to be taking over the technocratic management of what James was talking about, the bureaucratic interposition and management. You know, these are the people that are going to be on the Department of Anti-Racism. And you know, a fish rots from the head too. A lot of times, these schools were the skunk works, the laboratories for the implementations of these policies. We were doing this back in 2012, you know, and many places even earlier. So that's my sort of assessment of the broad picture of what it's like, what it was like at my schools and many similar schools.
So if you follow me on Twitter, you can follow at Moms for Liberty, and we'll make sure that everyone gives out their information, because a lot of these people I've met on Twitter. So if you're not on Twitter, you should be on there. Some great information going on. James likes to say there's a war happening in our country. It's happening in social media, and we all need to get involved and start having our voices heard. But the kids are not okay. Right? I think that's very clear to all of us. We've seen 2+ years of school shutdowns. We now have really no accountability, if we ever did, right? We to look back at how the kids are doing now, we're looking at 2019 data, and CRT is an excuse for educational failure. And so we're not really seeing how the kids are doing in school. So how are the kids in America? And I'll let any of you start. I wanted to have a real discussion about what are your concerns, what are the things that we kind of know are happening, are there any things we don't know are happening, and what can we do about some of those things?
Well, I'll give you some on-the-ground information. Like I said, we do run 3 charter schools in Florida at this time. Our first school opened in 2019, so we were interrupted by the pandemic in the middle of our first school year, and our second school was already ready to go for 2020, so we opened that one in the middle of the pandemic, and then the third school in 2021. So we haven't known a school year yet without some pandemic disruption, and they're all affiliated with Hillsdale College. You heard about that earlier, and we're running and implementing that wonderful, amazing classical curriculum. 2 of those schools are more in middle-class suburban communities. One is in downtown Jacksonville. It's more of an urban community. But I'll tell you right now that all of those children, especially those that were coming to us from outside the school, meaning they didn't return from one school to the other, it didn't matter where they were coming from. Private schools, public schools, they're behind. They're very, very behind. In our urban school, we had half of our students coming in were 2 or more grade levels behind. And we brought in the first year 450 students, and the second year another 400 students in downtown Jacksonville. And it's about 55% free and reduced lunch. And so it's not just those students. It's not just the students in poverty that are behind. It's also students, and when I talk about my first school, Treasure Coast Classical Academy in Stewart, which is more of a middle-class community, there were kids coming from private schools that were very expensive who were very far behind. And there was no, to your point, accountability or transparency for those parents to know how well those students were doing. And a lot of parents think if they write a big check and their student goes to a prestigious school, that means that they're doing well, they're on grade level, they're going to get into a good college, and that's just not the case. And I like accountability. I'm a proponent of accountability, but I believe accountability comes from transparency, not top-down government. But what the government can do is require a level of transparency that allows parents to make quality decisions about the schools that their children are going to and understand their progress in a meaningful way. So I'm very concerned about what the pandemic has done across our country, especially to our highest need populations. They will never catch up. We will have a generation of children who cannot read and never will be able to read in the manner that they should. We have a generation of children who've lost 2 to 3 years of learning that they will never get back. And it's a real concern, and it should be a real concern for all of us as parents, grandparents, and community members. How are we going to accommodate for what has been lost to this generation I don't think anyone has figured it out yet, and we can't even really articulate the depth of loss that has occurred as a result of the actions of school districts across the country.
Realistically, we're in the middle of a threefold crisis. We're in the middle of a crisis of academics, we're in the middle of a crisis of behavior, and then we're in the middle of a crisis of moral purpose. So first of all, again, as Erica said, the reading scores are abysmal. For those of you that don't know, and I'm sure most of you in here do know because you do your research, if you don't start reading well by 3rd grade, you will be crippled for life in your reading and comprehension. It is a long-lasting thing. It's very well documented on multiple sides of the academic spectrum. And we have students right now, a vast majority of students in this country that have been crippled in their ability of reading and comprehension that is not being made up. There is a quashing of the term learning loss that is going on, which is bewildering to me. I cannot believe that in this country we have media outlets like EdWeek and like Chalkbeat and like Edutopia that are on purpose making sure learning loss does not make it into their articles, because that would intone that the actions of many of the administration and many of the media in the last couple of years are responsible for lifetime consequences of our students academically. You want to talk about inequity. I want to see students who are already struggling from the situations that they've come from now. They don't know how to read. They can't do basic mathematics. They don't know civics. God knows Paul and I have talked about how they have no functional understanding of science and STEM, as is evidenced in gender theory. It's ridiculous, and I've seen it in rural, suburban, inner city. It's awful. Number 2, we have a huge crisis of behavior. My wife hates going to her job some days because there are students that if they are violent and hit her in her pregnant stomach, they will be maybe taken out of the room and then brought back not 2 to 3 minutes later, as if nothing was happened. I mean, of course, we've heard what's going on in Loudoun County, and there are cases of sexual assault, and the school's brushing it off and sweeping it under the rug. There are children in our country, again, a huge amount, that have no behavioral understanding, but we just want to teach them that their feelings make them justified, which leads to our 3rd problem, which is a crisis of moral purpose. There is no moral purpose. As the good Reverend said earlier, we have a crisis of materialism where we just say, get all the stuff you want. If someone else has more stuff than you, then you should feel enraged, and then you should want what they have and take it if they don't let you have it. There's no moral character, there's no moral fiber, and it's eating away our country from the inside. So as far as lasting effects, we are going to see a Generation Z and then Generation I Alpha following, that is more radically different than any other generation that has walked the face of this earth. And it will be the fight of millennials, Gen Z, and I Alpha who have been raised by good, strong parents in solid foundational homes to rectify the mistakes that have been done in this country and abroad.
I'm going to add, well said, both of you, or all 3 of you, should I say. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing, I want to take it a step further as well. We're in a spiritual crisis. This is really an issue of good versus evil. And the greatest existential threat to the world is sin. That's just the bottom line. I mean, you can call me just Bible thumping, whatever, but that's the truth. It's really at the core, it's sin. And so, I believe our children are in a bad position simply because the families are in a bad position. Once you dismantle the family, everything else goes with it. You know, everything else follows. You know, God's plan is perfect. At the core of every civil society is the family.
That's the first institution he founded.
Absolutely. So, and that means with a father and a mother there to create the balance. Not some of this other made-up nonsense, but the father and the mother creates the balance for the child. The family was ultimately designed to be the first institution by which that child could feel safe. So that's why some of the work that I've done in talking about the importance of fatherhood. You know, fathers do at least 3 things. They affirm, they provide, and they protect. So those are at least 3 minimal things that God do for all of us, right? The other reason why our kids are in a bad position because we have teachers who do absolutely nothing and still get paid. You know, they don't have to show up to work and still keep their contracts because the unions have negotiated some stuff. I've literally watched a teacher not show up to work for 2 years and get tenured. How does that happen in a school? Absolutely, that's absolute craziness. We have school districts all over this country, and I know Baltimore gets picked on, but I'm gonna use them because it was public knowledge. But they outspend 97% of all other large school districts in the country But yet 41% of the student body have less than a D average. And then you add on top of that the virus. Then you add on top of that lack of access to technology, because if they're studying or learning virtually, some of these kids or families can't even get web access, and then not even to mention the folks in the rural communities. I mean, that's even more of a disaster. That's kind of, that the local media is kind of being quiet on. So we have this compounding kind of an issue. And I just personally believe that, poor teachers need to be fired, period. End of story.
They just need more money. Just give the schools more money. That'll fix it.
We should absolutely not throw money. We also have, and I'm glad he said that, because we also have school districts, and if my wife is watching, she's like, oh, Lord, please don't let him say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. But we have school districts that have been given by foundations millions of dollars to deal with curriculum, but then they come back and then they actually push and pass bond initiatives, right, for another $44.8 million instead of developing or changing the culture. And I told a school board member this. I said, listen, people are not leaving the district because of curriculum. They're leaving because of the culture. Yep. Just what you said, a child can punch a teacher, curse them upside down the other, do anything they want, and there's no consequence. That is not how life works. Whatsoever a man sow, that shall he also reap. That stuff comes back. And if we're teaching our kids that you shouldn't have any consequence for your poor behavior, that's absolutely disastrous. You're setting them up to fail, and that's exactly what's happening in our schools.
And Paul and I were chatting about this over the last couple of weeks, and there's such a very weird phenomenon that's going on in this country where we have students that are running these incredible fight accounts. One of the Indianapolis public schools has literally a fight Instagram account where you can watch videos of them fighting. We were at Crispus Attucks High School in Indianapolis, one of the IPS schools. A teacher quit on the way to the meeting, handed her resignation to the principal who was on her way to present to us. And she said, we have requested that students who are being excessively violent been expelled. We've made either 9 or 12 expulsion requests, and the district has approved 0, because you got to keep that funding. So all of those things going on and percolating that we talked about in this school culture, unions get up and say, well, the teachers aren't getting enough money. We're not getting enough time. We're not getting enough resources. Realistically, as teachers, we're fed up with endless professional developments where I'm told I have to rank my class rate of racism by how many black male students I have passing compared to the next teacher that was at Lawrence Township, or whether we're supposed to sit there for nigh on eternity and have our schools misspend our money so they can bring in the Racial Equity Institute from the Carolinas, which charge hundreds of thousands of dollars per visit. And it's incredible to watch the culture of our country be completely ignored by teachers' unions, by these pro-public school organizations that are realistically just pro-status quo and upholding something that's been broken for nigh on half a century.
So I think that brings us to a really good point. We're talking a lot about culture and a lot about behavior. And one of the things that Tina and I recognize, and we've seen as school board members, unfortunately, the public education system, and as it has grown and grown and grown and taken over so many different aspects of our children's lives, has allowed parents to abdicate their responsibilities to a certain degree. Right? And so I think it's important as communities, as parents, that we recognize that we need to be partners in our children's education. We will not co-parent with the government. You know that. You see some T-shirts in here today, right? But we do want to partner with our children's teachers. So let's talk a little bit. We spent about a half an hour talking about some problems, and we've spent a lot of time talking about that, right, in the past day or so. Let's talk about solutions, right? So how can parents work to better partner with their children's teachers in school?
I'm going to go back to what she was saying earlier about the whole transparency and accountability piece, and I think that was kind of the theme or the tone. Parents, I think we're off to a good start, because we're starting to see again, because of folks like Moms for Liberty and some other groups all over the country, really start to push and advocate for parents to really get back involved and engaged into the process of educating their child, like sitting on school boards. And so I would start there, and I'm going to let the rest of them go on, but I want to start there because that's very important. And then again, that transparency and accountability piece.
I come from the private school world. In this world, the National Association of Independent Schools has directives that they give to all the member schools, to the boards of those schools, to the heads of those schools, and they specifically say in that material that the school is the quote-unquote senior partner in the relationship between with the parent. That they are the guardians of the child's education, that they are the trusted experts, and that when parents question it, they are to be managed, and they have specific ways of managing parents which are diabolical, in my opinion. They are doublespeak. They are humoring you. They are stringing you along. They are telling you that that whatever you say is very important. And I experienced this too as a teacher, in that I was humored. I was actually enthusiastically agreed with by the same administration that threw me under the bus when the chips were down. And in my world, my advice to parents is, unless you see it actually in policy, in a policy change by the school, or manifested in the instructions to teachers and the administration, it's not real. You cannot trust it. And the other component of the solution is that goes back to something James said, which was they want to call everything racist in order to control it. Yeah. Now, this is where the rubber meets the road when you have parents that are very, very vulnerable, and they don't have a lot of moral authority because they've lost connection with morality themselves, right? So they're vulnerable to these accusations. And so what I would tell parents is, no, look deep within yourself, right? Look in your conscience. If you know you're not a racist, you're not a racist, okay? And you can operate from that moral certainty, because what they've done is they've redefined what racist means. Yeah. They've redefined what a woman means. They've redefined what a vaccine is, right? If you debate the truth with false definitions, you cannot win. We need to get back to the true definitions of words. And we need to frame, instead of trying to prove, oh, I'm not racist, I believe in social justice too, which some people say is the way to argue. You have to show, you have to go back to those 10 principles that we heard earlier in the day, and you have to say, no, you are anti-liberty, you are anti-equality, you are anti-justice. And we need to make that point clear in the places where decisions are made, not just in the information stream, not just in writing articles, which are great, but where those public conversations with administrators take place, because that is where you actually move the decision making.
So Paul is a fellow at Chalkboard Review, and I already know we're going to get emails about that this afternoon, and I look forward to ignoring those. I'm going to flip it around. How many of you have seen the movie Hoosiers? Anyone out there seen the movie Hoosiers? Okay, that was the first school I taught in Indiana. And I would get up at 4:30 in the morning on some really cold winter mornings and go shoot free throws very terribly in that gym, because it was really cool. It was the Hoosier gym. And if you haven't seen the movie, you have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't care. So in that school, my parents took care of me. The union never spoke to me ever. My parents made sure that if there was something I needed, that I had it. If they asked questions, I answered them. And other teachers were doing things in the school that I thought they might like to know, I let them know. And it was that relationship between myself and those parents that not only got me through my first 2 years teaching, but I also think was instrumental in my getting Teacher of the Year both years. Because by working with those homes and saying, I am here to make what you do in the home stronger, well-protected, well-insured, well-enriched, and fully realized, I was able to strengthen their home as an outside partner, not as someone who has authority over their child and how they raise their kids, but as someone who is able to strengthen that. And I think that that's not talked about a lot today. There's like almost this level of dark, stormy clouds over talking with your teacher anymore, and going both ways, talking with your parents. And that is so sad, because it is within those conversations that I found out first if the kid was going through stuff, if there was trouble at home, if they were dealing with some kind of an illness, if they were struggling with whatever. And my parents expected me to communicate with them, and it was that equal amount of expectation and encouragement that not only got me through my first couple of years teaching, that helped me flourish, and that needs to be encouraged.
So, Erica, absolutely. Erica, I'd love for you to answer that question, but then I also want to kind of ask you as a fellow mom. I know you have 3 boys, right? So when a lot of these things are happening in the classroom, what's your advice to parents talking to their children about the fact that there may be things introduced in the classroom that are antithetical to the teaching in the home? And, you know, we need to have these hard conversations starting at earlier and earlier ages. Someone asked me the other day, when should I start talking to my child? And I said the first day that they're going, before they even go to school. You need to be having this conversation. So if you could touch on that a little bit too.
And I feel awful for any parent who feels forced to send their child to a place that they believe is teaching contrary to their values. And I would agree with the speaker earlier. The place is on fire. Get your kid out now and do whatever it takes to get them out of there, because they're being damaged. I had to do it at the time when I finally broke and took my child out of public school. I had to put the rest of the private school tuition on a credit card, and I couldn't afford it. But it was more important to me to go into debt than to allow my child to continue to be damaged in that school system, in the A school that I bought a house for the children to go to. But that's my story as a mom. So the first thing is get them out. Secondly, if you do have to or feel that you must continue to send them to a school that's teaching contrary to your own values, is to teach them at home. All values every single day, and ask them what they're learning in school and have that dialogue with your kids. But as she said, I have 3 boys, and when you ask the question, what did you learn at school today? You don't get a very long answer for some of these boys. If you have boys, you know what I'm talking about. So really the answer is to entrust your children very, very carefully, and be the parent who is in constant vigilance to your child's school, your child's teacher. One thing that I was going to give three practical ways that we can help with solutions, and one of them he just articulated very well from the home is support your child's teacher. Say, I'm here for you. Take the teacher's side, even if it's questionable. Stand with the teacher, because, these kids, they need to know that there's a united front between you and the teacher. And frankly, the teacher needs to know that there's a united front so that you can work together with your children. So that's number one, is really try to support your teachers as much as possible from the home. As a parent or community member, what Moms for Liberty is teaching you to do, going to the school board meetings, reading the agendas, understanding what questions need to be asked, what presentations that you want to see, and putting the pressure on your school districts to be more accountable and more transparent as a group, that is so critically important. If they are left to their own devices, there is absolutely no accountability. They run through the ranks of leadership, through the administration, through the unions, and then they sit on the school board and they call it accountability. It's all the same. It's literally all the same. If it's not us on the school board holding them accountable, they're all on the same side. There's not an accountability because they've been through the ranks and then they came up to the school board. So you must get on school boards, you must go to the meetings, you must read the agendas, and you must go through these trainings that tell you what questions that need to be asked and hold them accountable. And then finally, at the state level, usually is where you would advocate for school choice. If we had universal choice, parents wouldn't throw up their hands the way that they are. They don't do because they don't feel like what they do has any effect. If they don't feel like they have any option, they're going to behave as if the option that they're left with is the best one, if that makes sense. Because parents don't want to feel like they're not doing enough for their children, but the parents whose kids are trapped in a place that doesn't benefit them, or is teaching contrary to their values, or it doesn't even teach them to read, if that parent feels trapped in that space, they don't want to face the fact and that may make them a bad parent because they haven't done anything to change the situation. And we're not saying they're bad parents. Some of them are trapped. Some of them can't do anything. But we must do everything we possibly can to give every single parent a choice, because that accountability is going to come when every parent has to go to select a school for their child. And even if only 75% actually did it, which is what happens in Miami-Dade County, which is the largest choice district in the country, 75% of the parents in Miami-Dade County select a school that's outside their zone public school. And that's not an ideal system by any means. A lot of those are magnet schools, et cetera. However, it shows that there is a large majority of families, regardless of their level of income, that will actively choose a school if they're allowed that. And that provides them that ownership and that involvement that we need to see in order to maintain accountability long term. And that's what we really should be fighting for at the state level.
That's a great answer.
Can I add something else? Another tip for parents. One of the things that I've learned in the work that I've done, not only at the Department of Ed, but now here at Heritage Foundation, is if you have to go to the Sun to look for data on how that school district is actually doing and how your students measure up to their peers, for goodness sake, you talk about transparency. I mean, I've literally gone on to school websites, and they have what the kids had for lunch and how to get them signed up for transportation and all this other stuff. If you have to go through high heavens just to look to see what the district data is, that should be or pose of great concern. When you're talking about transparency and accountability, that means they don't really want you to know where they measure up.
It's like a website from 2003.
Absolutely.
Like runs on a potato.
15 clicks to go through. Yep. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Some PDFs put on there. Yep.
Right.
One little tip: if you have a child in an institution that has some sort of homework content management system, very often the parents don't have access to it independently. You can sometimes get access to that and see the assignments, see the syllabus, see everything that's that child's gonna be learning by petitioning the administration. Says, hey, I would like to be working with my child to support their learning. If they're having trouble in these classes, they usually can't separate it out, and that's a good thing anyway. I mean, that's what you want to be doing anyway. But very often they will respond to that in a way that gives you access to that material.
Canvas, Schoology, Chalkboard, Genzibar, and Discovery Education all have systems set up in place to provide independent access. And if any of you are told at any point in time that your school's LMS, learning management system, software, whatever, doesn't accommodate for that, reach out to us at Chalkboard Review, because I have a master's degree in saying that that's garbage, and that's not the way that is. Please reach out. We will get that resolved.
I'm going to open this up for questions. Is there anything else that anyone would like to share that we haven't covered yet before we get to questions?
No, I would like to just add, though.
Yes, sir.
On the table, there are some QR codes since we are celebrating the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At the Heritage Foundation, we actually had these shipped here. And so on the table over there, please grab one of these. You can scan it with your phone. It'll take you directly to levelupcivics.org, where we do have a MLK series of different videos to learn from on there about his life and the great work that he's done. And I also have other materials over there on the table as well. I see the CRT booklets left real quick. But there are some essential constitutions and those kind of things over there about the Faulkner Institute as well. So please have at it.
And the chalkboardreview.com has a critical race theory toolkit that will help you get started with the actual literature involved, including a reading list, including short summaries of the authors. Paul, I believe you actually helped us work on that.
Yeah, I have something in there.
Yeah, so that is updated semi-frequently so that you can read it yourself. I don't need to tell you why critical race theory is good or bad. You can read it and make that decision because you're competent researching individuals. That way, when the people out there tell you that you don't know anything about it, you can share the literature with them.
Wonderful. So we'll open up to questions right now. Please come up to I think there should be 2 microphones. There's one right here, there's one right here, and you're welcome. We'll take about 10 minutes to do that, and then we'll close out for the day. So yes. Hello.
First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for being here. All the speakers have been wonderful. I am a retired educator, still in education in the policy realm. There were a couple of things I just wanted to comment on, and then see if you have anything to add to that. We talked about discipline. One of the things about discipline is that the Federal Department of Education has incentivized the use of trauma-informed education and ACEs and all of those things. If you go back to the Broward County Parkland shootings, if you read Andrew Pollack's book, Why Meadow Died, he really outlines how the federal government incentivized and allowed the young man to do what he did. So I would encourage people in their districts to be looking into those federal programs and how they affect the discipline in their schools. The other thing is that there's a lot of talk among conservative, let me say Republicans, and I am one, so I'm not, bashing them, but this idea that we must create workforce-ready children is commodifying children. It's basically saying that we're going to build our businesses on the backs of our kids and how they perform. And we know that real estate goes up when schools suddenly seem to be doing well. And then in terms of doing well, I pulled my son at 17 years of age out of the district that I taught in for 20 years. Did testing of my own and found him 2.5 years behind in math alone when he was in Algebra 2 with a B. I would encourage parents to do their own testing, which brings me to the state testing. Have you advocated for having choice of what tests are given, or do you have to always be given what the state determines what is given? So why are we under one particular test? Why can't we have choice not only in the schools that we go to, but the testing that we do? And then the other thing is the school choice. I come from Louisiana. Horrible, horrible school choice laws there. If you take a dime, you're under the accountability system, et cetera. You know what I'm talking about there. Have you done any work to change the choice laws so that they don't manipulate you into becoming just another public school system? And then the accreditation, have you gotten information out to people understanding that they have been for years bringing those accreditations more and more under one organization so that they control how the school has quality, supposed quality? And by the way, public schools are accredited, just saying.
Okay, I didn't catch all those questions, but I have a few. Classical education, which I believe strongly in, and I work every day to expand the access to classical education to every family who wants it. It has educated people for hundreds of years for any job that's out there and any innovation that's out there, and that's what we really should be pushing for. The reason you see this CTEs, career and technical education, creeping all the way down into middle school now, this because they don't have anything else to offer. They're not providing anything of quality, so that now they want to show that they have taught the children some content, and instead of going back to the content that our founding fathers had in order to create this great nation, they're going to content like how to build this or that, and how to do certain careers. But we need to steer our entire system back to the high quality classics, history, and content that these children deserve. That's going to prepare them for any career after high school. There was one other, the accreditation. I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater completely on accreditation. I would love to have a classical accreditor, but we actually just went through the accreditation process because in Florida, you can have access to additional funding if you're accredited. So our classical charter schools are all accredited through Cognia, which accredits a lot of the public schools. And I was a little hesitant at first that they were going to have some kind of requirements that would require us to change our programming, but they didn't. And in fact, the process of accreditation through them just required that we had documented systems in place to make sure that all of our schools were operating in the same manner with the same policies and implementing it in the same way across the board so that our program was consistent. So if you went to an Optima school in Jacksonville or that you were getting the same program because that's what we're advertising, that's really what it was centered around. And it actually provided for some additional accountability because it had us survey our parents, our teachers, our board members, and other stakeholders, and it forces you to survey them on a frequent basis and give that information to your board publicly and have the board respond to the results of those surveys publicly. So there's a place for it. I totally understand the concerns about accreditation, especially when it comes to a monopoly, but accreditation can be used for the accountability that a lot of us have talked about and transparency that a lot of us have talked about. So we want to be careful about throwing it all out when some of them are using it in a way that's negative.
So to build off what you were talking about on CTE and the career technical education down into the middle school, when your kids can't read, when they don't have any concept of functional academics, use shiny toys. I wrote a piece on this for the Federalist. STEM education, in large part in many of our public schools, has become a scam. 90% of kids do not need to learn to code. Less than 1% of all tech-based fields in the professional work development life involve coding, but it's a fun game that you can put in class and you put the kids on autopilot and they learn to code. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with someone dedicating the time to learn something, but that's highly specialized to make specific state standards. Indiana's academic standards have like hosts of standards relegated to coding, and it's like, why? Because they're flashy, cheap, showy toys. They bring in the robots, they look really cool. I can play with the robots too, and they're all kinds of fancy stuff, and it's just a way for a lot of these organizations to make a quick buck and show off what looks like learning. Realistically, as opposed to classical education, which we talked about, and Jeremy Wayne Tate and the classical learning test as an alternative to the SAT and the ACT, colleges that accept the CLT are fighting over students that take the CLT because of how rigorous and incredibly deep you have to, or the incredible amount of effort you have to prepare to achieve a deep sense enough to pass the classical learning test. And understanding the classical literature canon is incredibly important. So I would really put, for those who are considering homeschool and private options, put more of your research into classical learning. Realistically, as to accreditation, I think that first we have to establish how a lot of our schools are grading in general. I alluded earlier that at Lawrence Township in Indianapolis, our principal told us that we needed to rate how we graded ourselves as educators based on the grades we gave our white students and then our students of color, so black students, then they say brown students, which is like 38 different cultures, but no one ever has any problem with that, which sets up the problem of equity grading, which is, Paul, that's more your specialty.
Oh yeah. Well, one of the things as I started to hear from parents who were, as the questioner said, pulling their children out from the burning building, is that when they would receive the standards for that grade and started to teach them and understand what the foundations were in math, in particular, it's just because I'm a math teacher, it would find that no, you don't know the foundations that you need to even be in the grade that you're in. And why is that? Why is my child have a B in algebra when they don't know how to solve a linear equation?
Racism.
Well, yeah, that's but some of it is, there's a new fad, there's a new trend, which is equity grading. So I'll give you an example. So, we, in a training session, a presenter says, well, it's unfair if a student knows 50% of the material to give them an F, right? We're going to redo the typical grade scale that most of us grew up with. 50. You have to get 60% to pass. 60 to 70 is a D. 70 to 80 is a C, and so on. So there's this really crushing of standards, really, because all under the guise that if you have performance gaps, and you identify those performance gaps, which are learning gaps, essentially, you are doing harm. You are blaming the child. This is a total red herring that is used to basically impugn the motives of the educators who are trying to give necessary skills to children so they can succeed. I don't think they want them to succeed. They want them to remake society. That is the ultimate aim. So they don't want to make a child fit the mold of what actually will help them move forward in life. They want them to be maladapted so that they change the society that they're entering. That's my 2 cents.
I just hope and pray, and I'm going to add this in here, I just hope and pray what you just said as far as that whole 50% not giving an F. But I hope and pray that our doctors, and by God, my pilot that's flying me back to D.C. didn't fail their certification test.
But was made to feel okay about it.
Yeah, but it was made to feel okay about it.
He passed with a 25%.
But he passed, for
though.
goodness sake. I'll drive back, for goodness sake.
One of the things we say, one of the things that we talk about at Moms for Liberty, and if you've served as a school board member, you know this, the only thing that school districts do better than protect themselves is celebrate themselves. And they don't want failing data because it shows that they're failing our children. And I've heard Tara say before, we have to stop funding failure, and we absolutely do. We have one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to Carol Swain to close us out for the day. Yes, sir.
Well, I am coming to this. This has been an eye-opening situation. There's a big elephant in the room. and I'm going to be running for school board.
Yay! Big round of applause.
But
Awesome.
Proud American.
my wife was in the metro school system. She was assaulted 3 times. Now, she prosecuted and got him out of the classroom. Now, there's a Clery Act that I've just been made aware of where you have to make known the abuses that have been done. But when the parents are not involved, how do you get the parents involved? I mean, we have non-participating parents. That's why we're part of the reason why we're where we are now. How do you get the parents involved when they just want to use the school as a babysitting service?
So that is a very key thing that you've mentioned that has gotten me a lot of flack from some parents. Some parents have done a really great job. However, the reason that a lot of parents started caring about what's going on in schools around COVID is because they were forced to sit in the same room as their child and see what was on their screen. No matter how you code it, that is a fault of those parents. Just as a lot of teachers I know make mistakes, a lot of parents are really late to the game. Now, I stand allied with those parents. However, there are a lot of parents that are not yet pulling up to the game to play. And sometimes we have to accept blatant truths and criticisms. I accept a lot of criticisms and things that I did in my classroom during my public school teaching days that weren't the best practices for kids. Sometimes parents, and I'm not talking about any of the parents in here, so if you would please put that tomato back in the ground, ma'am, thank you. Realistically, I think that more than anything, there are tough conversations that need to be had, and that valuing a conversation with a parent saying, look, your kid is failing and it's because they're not doing anything. And when your kid comes home and tells you I didn't assign homework, they're lying, because kids lie. And that's what they do, because we're fallen, sinful creatures and humans stink. And so within that, there are tough conversations that need to be had, and basically being very upfront and reaching out to those parents have been my method. And you basically have a 50-50. They may go off and do nothing and, you know, I'm gonna see their kid next year again, or they get involved. And you'd be surprised the number of people that breaks out of their shell and, you know, then they go ahead and invest.
For those who are running for school board and those who are involved at the state level or at the school board level, it's a culture change that has to happen. I really don't blame parents entirely. The very first letter I got when I put my child in kindergarten told me, do not try to help your child learn to read, because you need to leave that to the professionals at school. You might confuse them. You might confuse them if you try to help them at home.
That's what they said to my mom.
That's the first letter they sent out. And what does that tell me as a parent? We don't want you involved. And when you go to school board meetings, any one of you have been to a school board meeting, I'm sure you got the message that they don't want you involved. And so the culture from school districts says, thanks, but we've got it. We don't want your involvement. You're not helpful. You don't know what you're doing. And we've been sending that message to parents for years and years. Don't feed your children. We want to feed them. Don't bring your children to school. We want to transport them. Don't help them with their homework. We're not even going to send homework anymore. You might confuse them, right? So don't come to school board meetings. You aren't professionals. So it's really a culture that we need to completely revamp from the top, hopefully, for good school board members to do that from the top, to really welcome and involve parents in the process. You can't push them away and then say, why aren't you helping us?
Yeah.
Because that's the culture that's been created. It's got to be changed from the top down.
Yeah.
So thank you for your question, and thanks for running.
So I want, if we could give our panel a big round of applause.
Did you want to have us tell them where to follow us and whatnot?
I'm going to...
All right.
I'm going to make one last statement. One of our chapters just put up a billboard. It's our first billboard. Yeah, it's very exciting. I hope there will be many more Moms for Liberty billboards around the country reminding parents about, you know, the fact that they have the natural right to direct the upbringing of their children. But I just wanted to read to you. It's a quote from Thomas Paine, and we'll close. And then I want our panel's going to share with you how to get in touch with them. I prefer peace, but if trouble must come, let it come in my time, so that my children can live in peace. So I thank you all for being joyful warriors with us. And panel, how can we get in touch with you if we want to learn more about the work that you're doing?
Erica Donalds, Erica with a K only, Donalds with an S. All of my social media is at Erica Donalds, and my website is optimaed.org, where you can learn about what we're doing to help bring school choice to communities across the country.
My Twitter is Paul D, as in Damian Rossi. It is a mud wrestling match that is ongoing, and here's one of my tag team partners.
You can follow me on Twitter at TheTonus, TheTonus, because I still haven't grown up yet. And you can follow Chalkboard Review and read many great authors like Paul, like Frank McCormick down there, Chalkboard Heresy. You can read all of those at thechalkboardreview.com. All of our socials are at chalkboardrev.
Terris.todd@heritage.org. Terris, Terris .todd, Todd, @heritage.org.
And again, follow Moms for Liberty on Twitter, on Facebook. Go to our website, www.momsforliberty.org. We have some T-shirts over there and some more information about our organization. And remember, everyone is welcome to join. Thank you very much for having us today.
All right.
Thanks for the great work you all do.
Would y'all give another round of applause to Moms for Liberty for this afternoon panel? And I don't know, it's possible that some of the authors might have books over there that you can purchase. And so keep that in mind. We're selling books over there. The Moms for Liberty table is over there. And if you would really like to help us by doing some servant leadership, you have an opportunity by helping to clear the tables because we have to clean up after this event. And I would also like to tell you that we have free lunches in the back. And so if you'd like to take something home to your family, go back there and help us clear out some of those lunches. And then my last thing is I'd like to close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we come before you knowing that you are an awesome God, knowing that you are real, knowing that you cover us and that you see what is taking place in our individual lives, as well as what's taking place in this nation, this United States of America, founded by people who loved you, who feared you, who wanted a new nation, who wanted to be that shining city on the hill. And Father, you see how far we have strayed away from our Judeo-Christian foundations. You see the evil that's engulfed our nation, but you also see the people who are standing up, that remnant, Lord. And I pray, Father, that you would anoint each person that's in this room, that's watching, each person that cares about this nation, this world, our children, that you would anoint them, that you would embolden them, that you would order their footsteps, and that you would protect them. And Father, we declare in Isaiah 54:17 that no weapons formed against us shall prosper. Every tongue that rises in judgment thou shalt condemn, for this is the heritage of the servants of the Lord. And we pray, Father, for those with ulterior motives, for those that would fight liberty and justice, that would fight against our Constitution, that would fight against us, that you would, Father, open up their eyes. We pray that you would reveal yourself to them. And we pray that the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom, would descend upon these people and this nation. And we pray that the spirit of deception would be broken off America. We declare that it's not over yet. We declare that you are all powerful. We ask that you would raise up a mighty army. We ask, Almighty God, for a spiritual revival in America, that you would continue to reveal evil in high places. But Father, don't just reveal it. We ask, Almighty God, that people would be held accountable. It would be adjudicated. And I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.